Iran has named Mojtaba Khamenei as the country's new supreme leader, hours after U.S. President Donald Trump said any new leader will not last long without U.S. approval. Rising tensions in the Middle East are pushing global oil prices to their highest level since 2022, with the crude topping $100 a barrel. In response, President Je-hyuk has ordered strong measures to crack down on possible price collusion in the domestic petroleum market. As the rising oil prices fueled market jitters over the widening Middle East conflict, South Korean stocks had tumbled nearly 6% on Monday. The Korean won also plunged against the U.S. dollar, hitting its lowest level since 2009. President Je-hyuk presided over an emergency meeting today to check on the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on the local economy. He urged for price caps to be placed on oil products to bring down energy costs. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min starts us off.
Devising preemptive measures that can cover worst-case scenarios with a sense of urgency. That was President Lee Jae-myung at an emergency meeting of economy-related officials on Monday, which was organized as the conflict in the Middle East continues to pose risks on the local and global economies.
필요한 경우에는 100조 원 규모로 마련돼 있는 시장 안정 프로그램을 적극적으로 확대하고 정부와 중앙은행 차원의 추가 조치도 선제적으로 준비해야 되겠습니다.
President Lee once again called for strong measures against price collusion related to oil products and mentioned the need to stabilize prices.
최근에 과도하게 인상된 석유 제품에 대해서는 최고 가격 제도를 신속하게 도입하고 정유사와 주유소의 담합, 또 매점 매석, 사재기 등 불법 행위는 철저하게 단속하고 위반할 경우 그로 인해서 생길 이익의 몇 배에 해당되는 엄정한 제재를 가할 필요가 있습니다.
Noting that the country is highly dependent on energy imports, Lee called for the need to look for alternative measures to bring down energy costs and ease the burden on the lives of the people.
전략적 협력 국가들과 공조해서 호르무즈 해협을 경유하지 않는 대체 공급선을 신속하게 발굴하면 좋겠습니다.
The meeting was attended by officials in charge of finance, industry, and energy, among others.
The Industry Ministry will expedite related administrative actions so the price cap can be imposed within this week. The President also ordered officials to review expanding fuel tax cuts and directly providing support to consumers.
Tackling the economic challenges will be the single most visited topic this week, with the president urging the officials to turn the crisis into an opportunity. On top of that, President Lee is looking to reform the economic system in a more fundamental way. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
President Je-hyuk has thanked the leaders of Turkmenistan and Singapore for their help in evacuating South Korean nationals from the Middle East. In a written briefing on Monday, Blue House spokesperson Kang Wi-jung said he sent letters of appreciation to Turkmenistan President Serdar Berdimuhamedov and Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong for their support. Turkmenistan helped facilitate the entry of 25 South Koreans and their 4 Iranian family members from Iran into its territory last week. And Singapore also allowed 4 Koreans in Oman to board its chartered flights to Singapore over the weekend. And about 300 South Koreans departed Doha aboard a Qatar Airways flight on Monday after emergency direct flights between Qatar and South Korea were allowed, although regular services remain suspended. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, the aircraft took off from Doha at around 3:45 p.m. Korea Standard Time and is scheduled to arrive at Incheon International Airport after midnight early on Tuesday. Qatar's airspace is partially open, with only some emergency flights to Europe currently in operation. The Korean embassy in Qatar had been requesting the Qatari government and airlines to resume flights to Seoul in order to facilitate the swift and safe return of Korean nationals staying in the Middle East. Now, according to the Foreign Ministry, Doha accepted Seoul's request on Sunday, after which an emergency flight to South Korea was scheduled. Senior U.S. diplomats are visiting Seoul this week to discuss alliance-related issues. On Monday, the Foreign Ministry said U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Michael DeSombri, will visit South Korea from Wednesday to Sunday. Now, during his visit, he is expected to meet with Korea's Chief Nuclear Envoy Chung Yeon-do, as well as Deputy Prime Minister Chung Lee-hae and Park Jong-han, the Director General for Economic Diplomacy Coordination. During talks with Director General Jung, the two are expected to discuss North Korea diplomacy. The visit comes ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to Beijing later this month. The two may also discuss the ongoing situation in the Middle East. Ahead of his arrival, David Wiesel, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, is also visiting Seoul from Monday through Wednesday. The successor to Iran's new supreme leader has been named Mojtaba Khamenei, a largely shadowy figure with strong ties to religious networks. Though the U.S. continues to put pressure, the new leader looks to continue with his predecessor's strong policy toward Washington. An Sung-jin reports.
Iran has selected its new supreme leader following the killing of longtime leader Ali Khamenei. The country's assembly of experts named Mojtaba Khamenei as leader on Monday in what state media described as an overwhelming vote.
The esteemed members of the Assembly of Experts appoint and introduce Ayatollah Sayyid Mojtaba Khamenei, may God preserve him, as the third leader of the sacred system of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mojtaba now holds the country's ultimate authority over state affairs, including command over the military and influence over Iran's nuclear program. As the second son of Ali Khamenei, the new leader has long been considered a powerful but largely shadowy figure in Iranian politics, with strong ties to religious networks and security institutions without holding formal government office.
He has close ties to the IRGC. He served in the IRGC in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. He's also very closely connected to besieged forces, and he's going to have a hardline stance against the U.S., Israel, and the West in general.
The same expert noted that his rise from a father-to-son succession may stir controversy as Iran had overthrown hereditary rule following the Iranian Revolution. Mojtaba is also known for its hardline policies against the U.S., and President Donald Trump reacted sharply to the development. Trump had previously warned that any new Iranian leader would need U.S. approval to remain in power, and had described Mojtaba as a lightweight in an interview before the official leader announcement. Though Trump has notified that Iran would face pressure if its policies continue, with Mojtaba continuing its staunch anti-U.S. rhetoric with strong support from the Revolutionary Guard, his appointment could intensify tensions between Tehran and Washington. The regional conflict continues, with Israel launching large-scale airstrikes against military targets in Tehran and other areas of Iran. The strike struck the airspace command of the IRGC along with dozens of key facilities, including military bases, the Sharan oil depot and storage sites, and internal security centers. To date, the U.S. has suffered 7 casualties. Iran quickly retaliated, launching drones and ballistic missiles towards several Gulf states, raising fears of a wider conflict. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is rattling global oil markets. U.S. President Donald Trump says higher gas prices will be temporary and a small price to pay for security, while South Korea is closely monitoring pump prices and weighing a fuel price cap. Eun-jin has the details.
The conflict in the Middle East has effectively closed off the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting supply routes for the roughly 20% of global oil exports that pass through this narrow passageway from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Global oil prices surged past $100 a barrel on Monday. Global benchmark prices climbed sharply, with West Texas Intermediate jumping about 15% to $107.54 per barrel as of 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time, the first time since July 2022 that it has traded above $100. Brent crude also rose, briefly reaching as high as $111 a barrel. Market watchers warn that oil prices could keep rising, with Goldman Sachs saying oil could reach $150 a barrel by the end of the month if flows are not restored. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump said Sunday in a post on Truth Social that such short-term price rises were a very small price to pay for safety and peace, noting that prices would drop rapidly once the nuclear threat in Iran is destroyed. However, Trump is mindful of economic concerns as it remains a priority for voters, which could be directly reflected in the midterm elections. The Treasury Department has said it will soon release plans to mitigate the rising energy costs. In South Korea, gasoline prices continue to creep up closer to the 2,000 mark. According to the Oil Price Information Network, as of 9 a.m. Monday Korea Standard Time, the average price nationwide was approximately 1,897.7 won, or roughly $1.27 per liter. Diesel prices are currently higher, with the average price rising 2.3 won from the previous day to 1,920.1 won. On Monday, during a meeting between oil refinery representatives and the related authorities, Industry Minister Kim Jong-wan called for the implementation of transparent and fair petroleum pricing, saying that the burden caused by the situation in the Middle East should not be passed on to consumers unilaterally nor excessively. He also warned that any attempts to take advantage of rising international oil prices in a way that undermines efforts to stabilize the people's livelihoods will be met with grave responses. This comes as President Lee Je-hyuk urged the government to crack down on collusion between refiners and gas stations, price fixing, and hoarding, calling for strict punishment of violators. He called for authorities to swiftly implement a cap on domestic gasoline and diesel prices. 이은진, Arirang News.
And South Korean market continues to react to the Middle East situation. Local stocks opened the week deep in the red, with the benchmark Kospi shedding nearly 6%, while the Korean won extended losses against the U.S. dollar. Kim Jun-hong reports.
South Korea's benchmark Kospi closed sharply lower Monday, plunging about 6% to 5,251.87. The index slid right after the opening bell, triggering a sell-side sidecar. Losses later deepened past 8%, setting off a circuit breaker that halted trading for 20 minutes. The halt came just 3 trading days after the last circuit breaker on Wednesday. The Kosdaq also stayed under pressure, with a sell-side sidecar briefly activated during the session. The Korean won also weakened sharply, closing at 1,495.5 won against the US dollar, up about 19 won from the previous session. That marked its highest intraday level since the global financial crisis in 2009. The spike comes as global oil prices surge on escalating tensions in the Middle East, adding pressure across financial and currency markets. The sharp swings have raised questions over how long the instability could persist and how markets may respond in the coming days.
If the currency rises too sharply or volatility becomes excessive, there could be room for authorities to step in. The stock market is currently experiencing significant volatility due to the war. But sharp fluctuations after a shock usually ease over time, a pattern known as clustering, where the initial impact is strongest and gradually fades.
Earlier in the day, the Bank of Korea held a task force meeting to review the Middle East situation. It said geopolitical risks are driving excessive volatility in interest rates and the Korean won, and pledged to take stabilization measures if necessary. Kim Jun-hong, Arirang News.
A National Assembly Special Committee has advanced a bill supporting South Korea's planned $350 billion investment in the U.S. after holding back-to-back subcommittee and plenary meetings on Monday. The Special Committee approved the bill unanimously with bipartisan support. The legislation aims to establish a dedicated investment corporation and a risk management committee to oversee projects in sectors such as shipbuilding and semiconductors, as outlined in a bilateral agreement between the two countries. The bill is expected to head to the National Assembly plenary session on March 12th for final passage. South Korea Monday began excavating the remains of South Korean soldiers killed during the Korean War. Now, the work will be carried out at 34 sites across 22 cities and counties nationwide, including Paju and Yeoncheon, major battlefields from the war. This year, the Defense Ministry aims to find 200 remains, secure 10,000 gene samples from bereaved family members, and disclose the identities of 20 fallen soldiers. And the ministry will also carry out international cooperation efforts, such as a joint excavation project with Australia and the mutual repatriation of remains with the U.S. Now, at the 2026 Winter Paralympics over in Italy, Team Korea garnered gold in the biathlon and a bronze in the snowboarding. Our Park Gon-woo has the highlights.
South Korea's Kim Eun-ji topped the podium in the women's sitting para-biathlon in Italy on Sunday, making her the country's first female to win a Winter Paralympic gold. It's also Korea's first gold won overseas, with the country's only previous gold coming at the 2018 Pyeongchang Games.
I'm overjoyed to have won the gold medal sooner than I expected. I'm also incredibly happy that Korean women's para-snow sports have finally earned a medal.
In the 12.5-kilometer event combining cross-country skiing and shooting, Kim finished in just over 38 minutes, beating the second-place finisher by more than 12 seconds and 36 seconds ahead of third place. Athletes had to complete 4 shooting rounds with 5 shots in each round, with every miss adding 1 minute to their race time. In the para-snowboard event also on Sunday, South Korea's Je-hyuk claimed the bronze medal in his second Paralympic appearance, marking the country's first ever medal in the sport. Among the 4 finalists, Yi finished third behind athletes from Italy and Australia. Yi, who began his career as a non-para snowboarder, finally stood on the Paralympic podium after falling short at the Beijing Olympics 4 years ago. The achievements of both athletes were praised by President Lee Jae-myung, who said on social media that their efforts and passion in overcoming physical limits had finally paid off. With the 2 medals won on Sunday, Team Korea has already attained its goal of securing at least 1 gold and 1 bronze within the first 2 days of the 10-day event. More medal chances remain, with Kim Eun-ji and Je-hyuk both scheduled to compete in additional events, as well as other athletes. And with the country's best result coming at the Pyeongchang Games with 1 gold and 2 bronzes, attention is now turning to whether Team Korea can make new history. Park Gon-woo, Arirang News.
A new movement in Seoul, a city famous for its fancy nightlife, is reclaiming the weekend, one sunrise at a time, trading neon lights for morning mist and coffee instead of soju. Young Koreans are finding a new way to connect through morning raves. Our Jung Hae-rim takes us there.
It's 9 a.m. on a Saturday. While the rest of the city is just waking up, this space is already filled with contagious energy. Let's take a look here at a morning rave in Seoul. This is the Seoul Morning Coffee Club, a community built around Seoul's growing morning culture, hosting group runs and coffee chats. At a rave SMCC hosted from 7 to 10 a.m. at a hotel rooftop bar in central Seoul, participants dance, chat, and some just vibe with the music. Instead of cocktails or soju, the bar serves fresh juice, coffee, and non-caffeinated drinks, offering a space to connect without the influence of alcohol. The concept mirrors a growing global trend, with similar morning dance events popping up in cities like London and Amsterdam.
Since there are so many people I don't know, I wondered if I could really enjoy myself without drinking. But now that I'm here, the atmosphere is great. Dancing and meeting people give me a lot of positive energy.
Yeah, I mean, I went both in the nightlife and in the morning life, so it's really different, but at the same time it's also nice to wake up early and make friends in a different environment, so I like it.
The atmosphere is relaxed and respectful, without the usual chaos of a night out, just people enjoying the music and each other's company. Club founder Park Jae-hyun says in what many describe as a hyper-individualized society, this community provides a remedy for isolation, allowing people to form healthy bonds through shared activity rather than late-night drinking.
I'm a morning person, and because of that, I realized Korea doesn't have a lot of morning activities. I started by searching for cafes that open early and meeting people there. It turned into this huge community, and people seem to find comfort and feel less lonely through these morning interactions.
People always say they wish weekends were longer. If you choose to go out in the morning, it'll only be 10 a.m. when you get back home.
Korea was once dubbed as the land of the morning calm. But it's a different story for youngsters. For a growing number of young people, mornings are anything but calm. 정혜림, Arirang News.
Time now to take a look at what else has been happening in the world of sports away from the Paralympics. For that, we turn to our sports editor, Paul Neitz, here in the studio. Welcome back, Paul.
Hello, thank you.
Paul, let's start with the AFC Women's Asian Cup, a great group stage campaign for South Korea. Tell us more.
Yes, right. Unbeaten to finish as the winners of Group A. On International Women's Day, South Korea's international women's team secured top spots in the AFC Asian Cup group against host nation Australia in Sydney in front of a competition record crowd of over 60,000. The two teams played out a thrilling 3-3 draw. The pendulum swung back and forth with Moon Eun-ju opening the scoring 13 minutes in, only for goals from Alana Kennedy and Samantha Kerr to see the Matildas go ahead. Kim Shin-ji tucked away a 53rd minute penalty to level at 2-2. Then Kang Chae-rim made it 3-2 4 minutes later. But Alana Kennedy added her second and Australia's third deep into stoppage time to make it 3-3. Despite the late equaliser, South Korea secured first on goal difference. They are now through to the quarter-finals and will face one of the third-place teams from either Group B or C. Korea reached the final in the last Asian Cup in 2022, but lost 3-2 to China.
Right. Hopefully they can go on better this time around. Now, moving on to baseball, how's Team Korea doing at the World Baseball Classic?
Well, they're not out, but the route to the last 8 is not exactly straightforward, nor is it that easy. They must beat Australia tonight by at least 5 runs, while giving up 2 runs or fewer in 9 innings to advance. This is because it will go down to head-to-head records, with the 3 teams all tied on the same number of wins and losses. This comes after South Korea lost their last 2 games, first to Japan, 8-6 on Saturday, then 5-4 to Chinese Taipei on Sunday. Korea were actually saved by Japan, who beat Australia on Sunday. Had Australia won, Korea would be out. Tonight, they are facing Australia at the Tokyo Dome, with the game having started at 7 p.m. It is currently the 4th inning, and the score is 4-0 to South Korea. Korea haven't made it past the pool stage since 2009.
Really, fingers crossed. And finally, in golf, an LPGA win for Lee Mi-hyung over the weekend, right?
That's right. On Sunday, she won the Blue Bay LPGA, finishing at 11 under 277. He finished 1 stroke ahead of Zhang Weiwei and earned $390,000 in prize money. Her final round wasn't all that strong, though, having carded a 1 over 73, and 4 players were all tied for first. At one point, he became the first South Korean to win on the LPGA Tour this year, and in doing so, she secured her 3rd LPGA win and first since July 2017. 2 other South Koreans, Kim Ah-rim and Choi Hye-jin, tied for 5th at 7 under par.
Great stuff as always, Paul. Thanks for coming in tonight. I'll see you next Monday.
Yes, thank you.
It was a hazy early spring day in the capital area with a high level of ultrafine dust, while Gyeongsangdo and Jeju Island saw dust levels rising in the afternoon. And tomorrow looks like being as dusty as today. Meanwhile, the east coast of Gangwon-do province and parts of the Gyeongsangdo provinces will see rain through tonight, with mountainous regions of Gangwon-do province seeing up to 5 centimeters of snowfall. And it's going to be a colder morning tomorrow. tomorrow, even the southern regions will see sub-zero temperatures with frost in inland regions. Daegu and Gwangju will begin the day at just -1 degree Celsius. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will be getting up to 9 degrees Celsius. Gyeongju, Daegu, Busan will be all topping out at 12 degrees under sunnier skies. We'll continue to see large temperature swings of around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius throughout this week, so please take care. With that in mind, here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
저는 만 5살에 바이올린을 시작했는데요. 바이올린 소리를 워낙 좋아했어서 그 특유의 따뜻함과 약간 사람의 목소리 같은 목소리를 갖고 있거든요, 바이올린이. 저는 무대에 올랐을 때보다는 이제 혼자 연습할 때 더 큰 희열을 느끼는데 제가 표현하고자 하는 음악이 잘 나왔을 때 그때 가장 큰 기쁨을 느끼는 것 같아요. 그래서 저만의 색깔을 어떻게 하면 찾아갈 수 있을까 그걸 제일 많이 고민하는 것 같아요. 아무래도 연습을 할 때는 이제 생각과 고민을 많이 하는 반면에 무대에서 연주할 때는 정말 머릿속을 비우고 아무 생각도 안 하려고 하는 것 같아요. 무대에서는 자유롭게 콩쿨 무대도 저만의 독주라고 생각하는 자세를 가지려고 하고 있어요. 사실 바이올린과는 거의 제 인생의 대부분을 같이 해왔기 때문에 저를 힘들게 할 때도 많지만 제가 가장 사랑하고 아끼는 존재입니다. 작곡가가 전달하고 싶은 메시지와 또 제 자신이 관객들에게 전달하고 싶은 메시지를 모두 다 설득력 있게 잘 전달할 수 있는 그런 연주자가 되고 싶습니다.
The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pink Fong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-kyeon. The U.S. and Israel have now kept up strikes on Iran for nearly 2 weeks, and the crisis is beginning to look far more serious than a short-term military confrontation. Tehran has suggested that there could be room for mediation, but at the same time, hardline messaging and military pressure continue side by side. U.S. President Donald Trump is making it clear that, in his view, there is no outcome short of unconditional surrender, while Iran is moving to reinforce its leadership and signal that it will not easily bend. At the same time, concerns are growing over the roles Russia and China might play, the risk of retaliation across the Gulf, and the possibility that this conflict could spill into a much wider regional crisis. Tonight, we examine where the standoff may be heading and what the key turning points could be. For more on this, we connect to Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Busan National University. A big welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Seung-hoon Baek, researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Good to see you, Dr. Baek.
Yeah, it's great to be back Within the Frame. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, too. Now, let's begin our discussion right away. First with Professor Kelly. So, like I've said, the U.S. and Israel have now been carrying out strikes on Iran for about 10 days. How do you read into the current situation at this point?
Well, I don't think there's too much debate that there's been tactical and operational success. I'm not really sure that anyone thought the Iranians would be able to stand up to a sustained assault by the United States. The United States has been practicing air power going all the way back to World War II, right? We have a lot of air power here in Korea, right? Enemy air defense was suppressed fairly early, I think earlier than many people had expected. But the real question is sort of now that we have this sort of operational dominance, we can sort of strike almost anywhere we want, right? What's the point? And I think this is really where the Trump administration has been revealed to have not planned this conflict particularly well, right? I mean, there's the commentary is just really sort of overwhelming to this point, right? That we don't really know what the exit strategy is, that Donald Trump doesn't really know what the goals are. He's not really able to articulate it. You mentioned unconditional surrender. He said that, but he's also said like 3 or 4 other things. And so it's just not really clear how this is going to end. I mean, we're blowing up a lot of stuff in Iran to the extent that Iran is an anti-American state or whatever. It's a troublesome state. I mean, I suppose it's a win for the United States. I suppose it's better than it was 2 weeks ago, but there's no real clear goal toward which we're marching or moving. And the longer this drags on, I think the more and more that's going to become a real problem. U.S. allies like South Korea, the Europeans are going to ask, what are we doing? The U.S. public is going to say, why are we doing this, right? We already know that U.S. public opinion support for this war is pretty low. It's only like 35%. So, I think fairly clearly the president's got to get out there probably and give a big speech in which he lays out, here are the goals, here's what we're going for, and here's how this thing is going to end. If he doesn't do that, I mean, I don't know, it becomes like Iraq. It just kind of goes on and on and on, I suppose.
Right. So many are hoping for the situation and not to continue on and on for a longer period of time. But when it comes to the diplomatic track, on the 6th, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said for the first time that mediation efforts were underway to end the war. Dr. Peck, what do you think was behind that comment?
I think that comment was less a sign of surrender than a signal that Tehran wanted to open a controlled off-ramp without appearing weak. So Pezeshkian did not say Iran was ready to accept Washington's term, Instead, he said mediation should also address those who started or escalated the conflict, which means Tehran was trying to shape the narrative and avoid the image of capitulation. So at the same time, Iran's temporary leadership appears to have discussed suspending strikes on neighboring states unless attacks came from their territory. So the message was also aimed at reassuring Gulf states and preventing a broader anti-Iran coalition from solidifying. So in short, it was a diplomatic filler, but from a defensive and highly conditioned position, not from a position of reconciliation.
And shortly in response to that, President Trump had made it clear that, in his view, the only possible deal with Iran is what he calls unconditional surrender. Professor Kelly, what exactly does that mean in practical terms?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, it's worth pointing out, I think everybody probably remembers this. The last time the United States pursued unconditional surrender, right, it led to nuclear use against the Japanese and the Allies marching all the way into Berlin and, killing millions of people. I mean, my God, I hope that's not what we're talking about. I mean, I really hope that the president can articulate something a little bit less dramatic, a little less apocalyptic than unconditional surrender. I mean, if you tell your enemy that, they have to just give up everything, then, I mean, they're going to fight, right, to the end, right? I mean, at some point, you got to give them something, right? If you just say they have to give up every single thing, then there's no incentive for the Iranians to bargain and negotiate with us at all. They'll just fight to the very last man, right? And that's sort of famously what Hitler said, right? We just have to fight to the last bullet. And that's obviously not what we want to do here, right? I mean, our goal is not to sort of level Iran. And, the president is, he's not really given us too much to go on, right? That term, explicitly that term unconditional surrender, at least for Americans, that's going to sound an awful lot like World War II, right? I mean, because that's the last time the United States really used that. We didn't use that kind of language in Korea or Vietnam or Iraq, America's other various conflicts in the last 60 years. So, I mean, that's purposely hearkening back to, the most devastating war the United States ever fought. And so, I just don't know. I mean, is Trump picking this up from TV? He watches a lot of movies. Has he actually thought about this? Again, I just don't know. He's saying it over Twitter, which is not a particularly sort of convincing way to suggest that he's really thought this through, right? I mean, it kind of looks like he shoots these messages out on his phone. We're not really quite sure what to make out of it, and so here we are having these questions. My guess is, to be honest, is that he doesn't actually mean that, right? That it's if Trump can get some kind of deal, to use his language, from whoever takes power in the next month or so, that makes it look like Trump won. That's really important for him, for his voters back home. Then Trump will look for an exit, right? I do not actually think the United States is going to invade on the ground. I don't think we're going to burn Tehran to the ground. I mean, that kind of language, unconditional surrender, that's just so fraught. And my guess is he doesn't actually mean it.
So it could be Trump's way of strategic messaging and dealing with the current situation. But despite that warning from President Trump, Iran has selected Mojtaba Khamenei, the second son of Ali Khamenei, as its new supreme leader. Dr. Beck, give us some background on who he is and what does his selection actually mean?
So Mojtaba Khamenei is not a charismatic mass politician. So he's better understood as a behind-the-scene power broker, a mid-ranking cleric with deep ties to the Revolutionary Guards and the security establishments. So his selection does signal continuity, but I would be careful not to overstate what kind of continuity this is. It does not automatically mean an all-out hardline collapse into permanent confrontation. Sorry. In fact, precisely because Mojtaba comes from the center of the regime rather than from its margin, he may have more room to maneuver than almost any other candidate. He can reassure the guards and clerical corps, which gives him political cover that a weaker or more openly reformist figure would not have. So that means he's positioned not only to sustain resistance if necessary, but also, if he chooses, to explore tactical de-escalation or indirect bargaining with the immediately looking vulnerable at home. So I would read this selection as a choice for the regime coalition under pressure, but not necessarily as a proof that Tehran has locked itself into an irreversible hardline endgame. So paradoxically, because he's so embedded in the system, Mojtaba may be one of the few figures with enough internal legitimacy to shift tactics rather or later if the regime decides survival requires flexibility.
So it could signal a slight continuity inside within Iran's leadership. When we take that a step further, President Trump has warned that any future leader of Iran would not last long without his own approval. What are the realistic scenarios from here?
So there are three realistic scenarios. The first is escalation without regime collapse. So Mojtaba consolidate power, the guards rally behind him, and the war continues as a prolonged campaign of strikes, retaliation, and coercive bargaining. The second is controlled de-escalation. Iran keeps a hardline public posture, but quietly explores indirect channel for limited arrangement. For example, around shipping, attacking on neighbors, or nuclear file. And the third, and the most dangerous, is that the Israel and possibly the United States decide the new leadership itself is a legitimate target, which would push the conflict into even more riskier phase. So I think the most realistic path is the second scenario, wrapped inside the first. Khamenei wrapped inside the first, continued hardline rhetoric and military pressure in public, but some kind of quiet search for a managed exit in private.
So this leadership question would be a very important factor in the current situation. Then when we broaden this out a little bit, Professor Kelly, U.S. intelligence has raised the possibility that Russia may have provided Iran with location data on U.S. naval vessels and also aircraft. How likely is it that this conflict would grow into a kind of an indirect confrontation between Washington and Moscow?
I think indirect is the best word there. I'm not sure I would go so far, pardon me, to say that it's a war or even a proxy conflict or something like that. But I mean, it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin opposes the settlement that was imposed on the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. It's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin opposes the Western order in Europe, right? The United States, at least before Donald Trump, supported that, right? The United States was broadly sort of behind that settlement that Putin finds so obnoxious and intolerable. So to that extent, I think that's what's driving the Ukraine war. And so to that extent, sort of as a kind of disruptor, as kind of an anti-systemic force, right? Putin is interested in sort of shaking up the Western alliance and willing to support various countries and clients that make difficulty for Western states, right? And of course, that includes North Korea, right? But also Iran. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Putin was doing this. It's not too difficult. Russian intelligence assets are already in place, so it's not actually particularly too difficult to do this, right? The real issue, I think, the big step up, right, if the Russians really want to get involved, would be if they actually began to give the Iranians hardware. That, of course, would be, first of all, would they be using Russian weapons? Second of all, that would be difficult for Russia because they're fighting in Ukraine, right, and they're not doing particularly well. So if they actually started giving weapons to Iran, that would be a pretty significant move on their part to help the Iranians resist the United States. My guess is they won't do that. My guess is you'll see this intelligence sharing. I think the really sort of the awkward political side of it is how are the Americans going to respond to this? We know that Donald Trump really likes Vladimir Putin, and he talks to him all the time. He says how great he is and stuff like that. And it's really awkward for the Trump administration to be confronted with the fact that the Russians are basically helping our opponents, right? And the White House and the Defense Department have been dancing around that for the last couple of days. But if that gets any real traction with the American public, where it looks like Trump and Secretary Hegseth are looking the other way on the Russians helping us, I mean, that could be politically disastrous for the president. So I actually am really curious if this is actually going to get some liftoff in the U.S. media.
So it's also becoming a complex situation for Washington, indeed. Now, there's also the question of China, Professor Kelly. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the situation in the Middle East a war that should not happen and urged for a ceasefire. So with Beijing maintaining friendly ties with Tehran, what kind of diplomatic strategy do you think China is likely to pursue here?
Yeah, I think we're all kind of learning that China actually has something of a weak point. Right? I mean, it actually probably shouldn't surprise us too much, right? We've known for a long time that East Asian economies, including South Korea, import a great deal of oil from the Persian Gulf. But the Chinese responded really, really quickly, actually, and evinced some pain publicly, right? This shouldn't have happened. And that tells us, I think that the Chinese don't have the strategic petroleum reserve that we thought they did, that the Chinese are more susceptible to an oil cutoff from the Gulf. I would imagine China's going to be working on this a lot. They're going to be looking at pipelines over land and stuff like that. They'll be looking at alternative sources. But I think we've actually sort of found that the Chinese are a little bit more sensitive to oil imports than we had anticipated. More broadly, I think what the Chinese are probably worried about is that the Americans under Donald Trump are kind of picking off these smaller members of the axis of resistance or something like that, right? So the Americans are going after Venezuela, now they're going after Iran. It's pretty clear that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, wants to go after Cuba, right? Donald Trump doesn't really care about liberal order or norms or rules or anything like that, right? If Trump sees sort of a rogue state he doesn't like, even if he sees Denmark, right, he doesn't like, it seems like he wants to go after them. So if you're China and you're kind of propping these guys up, right, and the Chinese have been sort of sending aid and whatnot to various countries that make trouble for the U.S., you know, Trump is actually kind of turning out to be a real hassle. And so if I were the Chinese, I'd be a little bit worried that Trump might actually bring that strategy to East Asia.
So China may try to balance its ties while avoiding deeper involvement. Now, back to the region itself, the Iranian president apologized for attacks on neighboring Middle Eastern countries and indicated a willingness to stop. But since then, hardline rhetoric and further attacks have continued. So with Gulf states now warning of retaliation, Dr. Beck, how real is the risk of a wider regional war? And also, what do you see as Iran's strategic intention?
The risk is real because once Gulf states begin to feel that they themselves, not just U.S. forces, are under repeated attack, the political threshold for retaliation drops sharply. So Saudi Arabia has already warned Iran against further attacks and signaled that a retaliation is possible. What I see in Iran's behavior is a dual-track strategy. On one hand, Pezeshkian's apologies and talk of restraint suggest that the part of their leadership wants to avoid turning the Gulf monarchies into full combatants. So on the other hand, continued attacks and hardline messaging show that the security establishment still want to raise the cost of the war for Washington and its partner. So Iran's strategic intent seemed to be to regionalize the pressure without necessarily triggering a fully uncontrolled regional war. But that is a very unstable balance, and it could break quickly. So I think it is one of the concerns which I see what is happening now.
But when we look at the timeline ahead, Washington, the White House had earlier said that this operation could achieve its goals within 4 to 6 weeks. But Dr. Beck, how likely is it really that this crisis could really be wrapped up quickly? And what's the single biggest variable as of this moment?
So I would be cautious about the 4 to 6 week timeline. I mean, a military campaign can degrade capabilities quickly, but translating that into a political end state is much harder. So especially now that Iran has chosen Mojtaba Khamenei, which likely closes off any easy path to a rapid political settlement. So I do not think this can be wrapped up quickly in any durable sense. It may become less intense at points, but that is different from being resolved. So the single biggest variable now is not simply battlefield attrition. It is whether Washington and Jerusalem defines what are the success in limited terms, weakening Iran's capabilities, or in maximalist terms like reshaping the regime itself. So if the objective stays limited, an off-ramp is still conceivable. But if it expands, the war becomes much harder to end.
Right, so it's a quite uncertain situation and it's quite complex right now. But before we conclude our discussion, let's also touch upon Korea, Professor Kelly. There are signs that some U.S. forces Korea Patriot batteries have been moved to Osan Air Base and Pyeongtaek, and some observers believe this could be a preemptive step before sending those assets into the Middle East. So if that happens, is there a risk of creating a gap in the Korean Peninsula's missile defense system?
Well, to the extent that they're moved out rapidly, yes, there's a possibility of a brief gap. But I would just point out, and many others have said this too, right, that South Korea's got a really good defense industry, right? Korean air and missile defense is part of the three-axis system, and people have been talking about that for 20 years. To be honest, it's actually kind of overdue for the South Koreans to have much better domestically, indigenously produced missile defense, right? If this kind of ultimately pushes the Koreans over the line, so much the better. My own sense is that this is sort of the larger issue that this is reflective of is that Western militaries, modern militaries, are using far more interceptors to shoot down incoming missiles than people had anticipated. This is something we're going to all have to learn from the Ukrainians, I think, in the next few years. South Korea is probably going to have to learn that too, right? Using Patriot missiles to shoot down drones is unbelievably expensive, right? The cost ratio there is absurd. And so we're all going to have to start looking around to find much cheaper air defense. I would say that South Korea has a window of opportunity here, again, because the South Korean defense industry is so good. I wouldn't actually be worried that North Korea would sort of like look to use some kind of window to strike or something like that. I don't actually think that the North Koreans are going to see this as some kind of grand opportunity, or China. So if there is any kind of slippage, my sense is that it'll be short. And arguably, honestly, I mean, it's South Korea's country, right? I mean, South Koreans should be spending more on defense to fill in any of those gaps, right? I mean, ultimately, the United States has sort of obligations and interests all over the world, whereas South Korea's immediate homeland defense should probably be primarily South Korea's responsibility.
So not really a very concerning situation for Korea right now, but clearly it's this crisis is having implications for beyond the Middle East, and we will definitely be watching closely on how it will develop. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Dr. Baek, we appreciate it.
Likewise, thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.